From its humble beginnings and throughout the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church was the predominant church in Europe, and it was very powerful. Over time, with that power came corruption and a falling away from traditional church practices. Eventually, this led to major protests, changes, and a breaking away from the Roman Church, which marked the beginnings of the Protestant movement. Join us as we look at this major turning point in history, the Reformation. In our program, we have three subject matter experts. Jeffrey Aubuchon, historian, St. Anselm College, Manchester, New Hampshire.
You have this humble man, known in history as Jesus of Nazareth, for 3 very brief years of his public career, going from town to town in a very remote corner of the Roman Empire. And he starts this radical movement that motivates thousands of people.
Sister Kelly Connors, the Sisters of the Presentation of Mary, Manchester, New Hampshire.
I think the Reformation was absolutely necessary, and we are where we are today as a society and as a Catholic Church and the various Protestant churches that grew out of it, much more sound in our theology.
R. Guy Irwin, Professor of Religion and History, California Lutheran University, Thousand Oaks, California.
If someone were to ask me what the most important effect of the Reformation for us today was, I might say the growth of the idea that it's the individual conscience that is determinative for religion and not the overarching social construct. That true faith is a matter of conviction and not a matter of belonging to a community any longer.
To understand the profound impact that the Reformation had on Western civilization, it's important to understand the historical background. Over the centuries, the Church, and in particular the popes, had become deeply involved in the political life of Western Europe.
The Empire of Charlemagne had after a period of a few hundred years, had declined, and individual national monarchs had risen in importance. That Europe was really being born, France, England, and Spain. And of course Germany remained an area that was theoretically ruled by an emperor. But that emperor was not a strong unifying figure. In this vacuum of power, the papacy, as the only institution that could claim to be universal, the only one that could really express universal power, began to think of itself in secular terms.
They are now in charge of not only the church's treasury, but the political treasury as well. And it's a shame, but gradually, and this is a period over 1,000 years, corruption sets in.
Another milestone in the history of the Church is the Crusades. From the late 11th century to the late 13th century, Christian armies went to the Middle East in attempts to free the Holy Lands from Muslim domination. The Pope who launched the Crusades was Urban II. He was Pope from the year 1088 until his death in 1099.
Well, Urban II, who is the Pope, decides this would be a good idea for me to show my power and to gather troops across Europe to gain support for his campaign, a military campaign.
Even now, the word crusade, derived from that, is one that horrifies large segments of the world population. Muslims hear this as a call of absolute Christian certainty and a call to kill those who don't believe. Ideas that we, in our way, sometimes have associated with Muslims themselves, they associate with us, a kind of radical, fundamentalistic, aggressive religious impulse.
So he told people that if they went on crusade, if they would go and expel the Muslims from the Holy Land, they would receive the forgiveness of sins that they had committed, called an indulgence.
Ultimately, there is also a financial aspect. Again, this is a way in which an otherwise fairly innocuous practice becomes abused. The payment that an individual made in exchange for an indulgence was a gift to the church. Out of charity and love, one makes a contribution to the larger work of the church, and in return, the church recognizes one's goodness, one's charity in that by granting one an indulgence.
The practice of awarding indulgences became one of the key issues of dispute during the Reformation.
I mean, you're telling people that you can erase their sins. This practice continues after the Crusades for the next 500 years. And by the time we get to the Renaissance, there's this monk, Johann Tetzel, running around Germany selling indulgences.
Tetzel was probably the most famous of the indulgence merchants, the indulgence salesmen of his day. He had a very direct and somewhat, from our standards, somewhat crass approach. He would go into a town and preach a series of sermons in which he would try to convince the townspeople that they desperately needed the kind of relief that this indulgence would give them, and convince them of their need, create a market, and then proceed to sell it to them.
Now remember, the indulgence was originally granted for service to the Pope in the Crusades. Now, Tetzel is selling them for a price, saying, if you pay the church enough money, your sins will be forgiven, you'll have a free ticket to heaven.
The little jingle that is associated with him as a sales technique was, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs.
The growing corruption brought many early attempts at church reform. But despite attempts at church reform and General Council's call to impose reforms, discord continued to grow in the church.
So by the 1500s, the papacy has become completely corrupt. The Crusades had shown the brutality that the church was willing to unleash on other people. And so over that 1,000-year period, from the time when Rome fell to the High Renaissance, the church had become completely corrupt and abusive.
Churchmen as early as the 1300s were criticizing the administration of the church and began to doubt some of its teachings. For example, the church insisted that it alone had the authority to interpret the meaning of the Bible for the people. An English priest, John Wycliffe, who had translated the Bible from Latin into English in 1382, maintained the people had the right to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves.
Wycliffe had criticized the church already in England on the basis of its avariciousness, its greed, the corruption of the clergy. He doesn't attack the Pope directly as much as he attacks the clergy of England, although the implication is clear that the church is corrupt in root and branch, that every part of it is corrupt, that it has made a business out of its own sacraments, that a serious change needs to be made.
Wycliffe's ideas spread to Bohemia, where Jan Hus widely preached them in powerful sermons.
Hus himself came to a bad end. His teachings were condemned by the church ultimately. He was tricked into attending the Council of Constance, a gathering of the church held in Constance in the south of Germany, and having been lured there by the promise that he'd be allowed to return safely if he came to argue his points, the logic was applied that one needn't be faithful to the promises one makes to a heretic. And he was burned at the stake there. And a lesson to all who would criticize the structure, the hierarchy of the church.
The work of Wycliffe and Hus set the stage for the work of another church reformer, Martin Luther.
Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk and priest who was a very solid theologian in his day. He had some issues with the church of his day. The order that he was a member of was more strict, so he wasn't caught up in the variety of indulgences and corruptions that were going on.
Luther developed new ideas opposed to the church. He rejected the authority of the Pope, and like Wycliffe and Huss before him, set up the Bible as the sole source of Christian truth. He denied that priests had any power that laymen did not have. In 1517, Luther compiled his 95 Theses, or statements, of his beliefs about the state of the Church and posted them on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral.
Luther says in the Theses that if the Pope can do this, if the Pope has the power to forgive the sins of the faithful in this way, and can do so for a fee, why doesn't he emulate Christ and do it for free? That's the really subversive part of the 95 Theses, is that Luther hits the papacy in the pocketbook by saying that it is abusing sacred things. It is really trafficking in holy things for profit.
The Church insisted that Luther recant what he had written and apologize for his other perceived discretions against the Church. He refused.
So he went for this trial, but it really wasn't a trial. And what happened was they had all of his documents there, and they said, recant or you're excommunicated. Take it back and say you didn't really mean it, or you're out. And he said, this assembly has no authority. The Bible is the only authority.
The Church excommunicated him. With the help of a friend, Luther hid out at the castle of Wartburg. In the meantime, Luther's ideas are being disseminated throughout Europe. With the printing press, it was now as easy to make 1,000 copies of something as it was to make one. It made spreading the news much more rapid.
It's thought that the period of time between the first printing of the 95 Theses and their reaching the farthest parts of Europe, Spain, for example, was only about 6 weeks, which in the terms of the time was lightning speed. And suddenly, someone really obscure like Luther, who was a junior professor in a university that was still only 10 years old and had really not been heard of by most of Europe, suddenly he could be known by everyone. He becomes, in a way, Europe's first media star.
The language Luther used in his 95 Theses was Latin, which could be read by educated people in all European countries. The printing press delivered the message rapidly with no time needed for translation.
And the issues that Luther raises are one of the things that really makes the printing press a propaganda tool for the first time. Not just a source of devotional books and Bibles, but really a force to change the world.
Some of his followers had taken the Reformation movement farther than he had wanted it to go. His religious ideas were having an influence on politics and society as well, and in some cases people were rebelling against their rulers. He delivered a series of powerful sermons criticizing the use of violence. He said that revolts would only lead to destruction and the killing of innocent people. His efforts, however, did not have much success. The Reformation was partly an outgrowth of the Renaissance and the humanist movement. One of these humanists, an important Renaissance scholar who shared the ideals of the Reformation, was Desiderius Erasmus, also known as Erasmus of Rotterdam.
And Erasmus, who is the leading figure of his age, really, intellectually, he's the person to whom everyone looks as the consummate scholar, the man who knows the most about the writings that make up the heart of Christianity.
Erasmus was ordained a Catholic priest in 1492, but eventually found religious life distasteful. He turned to a secular life and devoted himself to teaching and writing. He translated the New Testament into Latin. It was a more accurate translation than the Latin Vulgate used by the Catholic Church.
Erasmus's influence was the greater for his being able to make himself popular with groups of people who might, in fact, otherwise have had reason to oppose him. But his example, his idea that if we study the ancient texts of the religion, of the faith, more thoroughly, with greater desire to understand what Jesus really said and how Jesus really lived, that we could change the church as it is, that idea is a really powerful one. And people like Luther and Zwingli and later Calvin really pick up from that. In some ways, without humanism, the Reformation would have been inconceivable. It's the intellectual ancestor of the Reformation.
Because his writings made such an important contribution, Erasmus is sometimes called the father of the Reformation. He is also charged with having laid the egg that Luther hatched. He half admitted the truth of that charge, but said he had expected quite another type of bird. He never took sides with Luther in his Reformation movement. Other reform movements arose outside of Germany. In Zurich, Switzerland, a priest by the name of Ulrich Zwingli embraced Luther's teachings, and by 1519 had shifted the Zurich church to Protestant ideals.
Zwingli began the ball rolling in Switzerland in taking down that opulence, of stripping the churches bare, of guiding the people in a way that was more meager, more dedicated to God, still, again, rooted in that dynamic of faith being the source of salvation, not how much you have, not how good you look, not how much you can pay.
Zwingli really thought that the church needed to throw out whatever could not be found in the New Testament. He doesn't come to this idea all at once. It's a gradual process. But he becomes the preacher in the cathedral in Zurich, an appointment by the city council of Zurich. And he propagates this idea to the people of Zurich so effectively that in a series of governmental actions, they actually undertake a reformation of the church, a changing of the way the church is run and the way worship is carried out in Zurich.
From the group surrounding Zwingli emerged those more radical. From the far left of the movement came the Anabaptist sect, who split on baptism issues. They refused to swear oaths or bear arms, and taught the strict separation of church and state. Two decades after Luther, John Calvin became another of the great 16th century reformers. His work and teachings had a profound impact on the development of Christianity.
In many ways, the most important figure of the Reformation for English-speaking Protestants is John Calvin, because his influence in the English-speaking world was greater than that of Luther, in part because of the way the Reformation in England worked out, but also because modern English-speaking Protestants are influenced to some degree by the Reformation in the Netherlands and in Scotland, places that were very heavily influenced by Calvin.
Calvin was a charismatic man, and he spoke with such authority, he held people spellbound.
And he actually wanted to embark on a theocracy, of this whole idea of the society, the structure of society being run by what is said in Scripture.
One of the things that's important to remember about Calvin and his career as a reformer is that he really represents the second generation of the Reformation. When he was born in 1509 in France, the Reformation was almost ready to happen. That by the time he was old enough to study in the university, it was something that had already happened. He really lives his entire adult life as a person in a world that has already been divided on religious grounds.
Calvin wrote Institutes of the Christian Religion in 1536. It became a rallying point for Protestants all over Europe. It is considered his masterpiece.
He spent the rest of his life essentially perfecting the same book, which between its first publication in 1536 and its last publication not too long before he died in 1564, expands fourfold in size.
Calvin's teachings are the basis of the Presbyterian and Reformed churches. He also greatly influenced the Huguenots of France, the Protestants of the Netherlands and Scotland, and the Puritans of England.
Calvin is, I think, unquestionably the greatest systematic theologian of the Reformation. He takes Protestant ideas to their ultimate conclusions.
During much of Luther and Calvin's lives, the King of England was Henry VIII. He brought about a Reformation of his own in Great Britain.
When the conflict breaks out in Europe between the papacy and the followers of Luther, Henry chimes in with a book that he writes himself called An Assertion of the Seven Sacraments, defending the traditional system of seven sacraments against Luther's contention that the only true biblical sacraments were baptism and the Lord's Supper, the Holy Communion.
And for this, the Pope rewards him.
As a consequence of Henry's having written this book, the Pope rewards him with a special title, Defender of the Faith, which he can then add to his other titles.
But Henry VIII has a problem. He desires an annulment of his marriage from Catherine of Aragon, since she failed to give him a son. The Pope refuses.
Henry VIII passes through Parliament the Act of Supremacy, making himself the head of the Church in England, saying that he was more in control of Catholics in England than the Pope was in Rome.
The Roman Catholic Church is replaced by the Church of England as Great Britain's official church. Some in England were not happy with the Church of England and wanted to see even more reform. Those reformers were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of any remaining Roman Catholic practices. In the early 1600s, their dissatisfaction with the Church of England led them to the Netherlands, and eventually, in 1620, to Plymouth, Massachusetts. In answer to the growth of the Protestant movement, the Catholic Church instituted its own series of reforms, called the Counter-Reformation, that balanced real reform with a firm reaction to Protestantism.
There were also a number of scholars and other church leaders, including cardinals, who wanted to see the church reformed, not only because it would answer the charge of the Protestants that the church was corrupt, but simply because it was the right thing to do.
The Protestant gains in Europe and the chaotic evolution of the Counter-Reformation finally forced Pope Paul III in 1545 to convene a council in Trent in order to define church doctrine once and for all. This council, the Council of Trent, worked on this problem in 3 separate sessions from 1545 to 1563.
The Council of Trent was both an attempt to answer the charges of the Protestants, to stamp out heresy, to contradict them where it could, and at the same time it was an effort to reform the church, actually to make it better, to make it more apostolic, to return it to the ideals of the early church, even while preserving and defending the structure that existed.
This council eventually advised some far-reaching reforms in the abuses practiced by the church, such as the selling of indulgences.
But what it does in the course of its 3 sessions, the 3 periods of years in which it meets, is that it rejects the Protestant claim that only through faith alone one is saved. It reasserts the old view that the church's mediation is necessary for salvation to be effective.
The reforms were very bold in many respects, but they were too little, too late. It was inevitable that the growing division between the Christian churches in Europe would lead to a series of armed conflicts which continued from the latter half of the 16th century into the beginning of the 17th century. The religious wars eventually involved every state in Europe. These wars, which took on political as well as religious overtones, resulted in widespread devastation and loss of life. The Protestants were no longer fighting for a reformed church. They were fighting for survival.
Within Germany, the Protestant Reformation works itself out as a kind of civil war. In the course of the 16th century and well into the 17th century, Europe is racked by wars of religion as a consequence. At first, they have the nature of a German civil war, but they extend out ultimately into France as well. And it is in France that some of the most bloody parts of the wars of religion actually take place, when rival families who have claims of different kinds to the throne of France work against each other and ally themselves with religious factions in order to secure political power. The intertwining of political and religious issues in this time is so deep and so complex that one can't be considered without the other.
The wars of religion in France finally ended in 1598, when Henry IV of France signed a law called the Edict of Nantes, giving the Protestants a number of rights, including the right to worship as they please. But the 30 Years' War, another partially religious, partially political war, raged in Germany until 1648, when the Treaty of Westphalia ended the bloodshed.
Just as it's hard to say when the Reformation really began, in the same way, the end is also impossible to pinpoint with any degree of accuracy. But one of the things I would think of as being a mark that the era of the Reformation had come to its end is the fact that after essentially 100 years of religious warfare, it would become a permanent reality that people in Europe would have to live with this religious division forever from that point onward.
The complexion of Europe had totally changed by the mid-17th century, and the colonization of North America was fueled by one of the most significant social upheavals of history, the Reformation. And it all started with a modest, humble, yet very dedicated priest, Martin Luther.